We don't have much left on transgenderism and the homosexual ideology of the last 40 to 50 years. Bill, this stuff goes away. Now, it could be 10 years, 15 years. That's pretty much historically about how long these things last. Okay, they don't last forever. Okay, you can come back to me and say, Kev, it may be another 40 years. Okay, I'll grant you 40 years, whatever. But it's not going to be forever. Okay? Why? One simple reason. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And welcome, friends, to the Generations broadcast. Kevin Swanson, your host, with you today. Another segment of Worldview News and Review, and we play off of the worldview.com, the 5-minute update we give you every weekday. And Adam McManus is the host of that program. He joins us on this edition. Welcome, Adam. Good to have you here.
Thanks.
And also, Bill Jack from Worldview Academy is also in studio. So we want to comment on news. We believe that news is important. Why? Well, because these are the things that are going on in God's world. Remember that news is the last 24 hours of history. So if you don't like history, you're going to hate the news. But you shouldn't hate history, and you shouldn't hate the news. Why? Because history is important. What goes on in the world is also the work of God, as well as the work of men. So we see God's hand in history, as well as the hands of men all over history. We actually appreciate what God's doing.
You're right.
More than we appreciate what man is doing, but
man
God's hand is in it.
His sticky little fingers off liberties.
If man would just get his sticky little hands off of our liberties and sticky little hands off of God's law and just maintain the principles of God's law, I think we'd be doing well.
Instead, just fold their hands and bow their knee.
To fold your hands and bow the knee and fear God and keep his commandments. That sounds like the whole end of the matter.
I think so.
Okay. All right. So that's it. Now we're going to review what's happened, and I think one of the most egregious things that's happened in the history of the state of Colorado, and certainly up there in terms of the most egregious laws ever passed in the history of the United States of America, was the approval of abortion in 1967 on the part of this state. Now, I'm not going to talk about that, but talk about HB 1312.
Right. So
Colorado seems to be at the forefront of doing the most nasty things in the history of mankind, or at least in the history of this country. And would you agree, or would you say I'm exaggerating the case that the homosexual governor of the state signed HB 1312 last weekend?
Yes.
It was bad.
It's awful. And it's egregious, and already what we're seeing is the rippling effects of this law, and we see that with the camp, a Christian camp that's been around since 1948, and that's Idra Haji. And it's short for I'd Rather Have Jesus.
The I'd Rather Have Jesus camp came face to face with this problem. But we are going to address, just for a moment, the situation of the governor, the homosexual governor of Colorado, signing HB 1312. And they took out some of the bad language, but really left the core of it still there. And the idea that somehow this thing's been defanged is not true.
It's not true.
It's not true. This would be a violation of the 7th commandment, right? The adultery commandment, the commandment dealing with sexuality and gender. Mm-hmm. This is a violation of the 1st commandment. That is, the state has stepped in and tried to be God on this issue. And the 8th commandment, which violates personal property, that we have a right to our own property, and government does not have the right to seize our property or to control what happens on our land and with our capital investments that we have placed. And Camp Idra Haji's an example of this.
Yes, and from a secular perspective, it's a violation of parental rights and the First Amendment, free speech. Mm-hmm. This violates not just God's law, it also violates man's law that has established liberty in this nation. And we have seen that this is going to really create serious problems, and we'll see that when we talk about the Idra Haji issue.
Well, and the Colorado legislature has passed HB 251312, and it effectively forces private businesses to recognize transgenders. And this includes places of public accommodations, which, by the way, if you look at the, how legal definitions are provided for places of public accommodation, they are, but not limited to, hotels, restaurants, banks, cinemas, pharmacies, amusement parks, and private schools.
Right.
This is pretty significant for private colleges, private schools, camps.
Yes.
We're going to get to that in just a moment. They took out some of the legislation relating to parental rights, but wow, this is a pretty big step in the direction of kowtowing to the transgender population.
Yeah, this is not
forcing
tyranny.
Thoughts, putting thought crimes and speech crime on people that will not acknowledge this transgender idea, that somehow
it was
a person
labeled
should be take on a gender that was not their birth gender that was established by the Creator himself.
It was labeled as a gender affirming bill, but it's a transgender affirming bill.
Right.
It's not a sex affirming bill. Biological sex affirming bill is a transgender affirming bill.
Adam, you covered this story on the Worldview. Your thoughts on this one?
Well, it's important to define two things for those new to this controversy. Number one, dead naming, and number two, misgendering. They're odd terms, but you need to understand what they mean. Dead naming is anyone, including the parent or the teacher or the employer, having the audacity to use the given name of the person who is pretending to be the opposite gender, who has now taken on a new name, either a gender-neutral sounding name or an opposite gender sounding name. The second issue is so-called misgendering, where a parent, an employer, a teacher is guilty of using the biologically accurate pronoun to describe a male as he or him, a female as she or her, because that person, that transgender, gender-confused person, wants to be referred to by opposite gender pronouns from their biological reality. So if you're guilty of either dead naming or misgendering, then you're in a heap of trouble. You could lose custody in an unfortunate development of divorce in your marriage, or you could be fined in a camp or lose your job as a teacher. I have said, and I think it's important to reiterate that, look, you can pretend to be something that you're not, but don't force me by the arm of the state to pretend along with you. I should have the right, as Bill indicated, to use my freedom of expression and speak the truth.
Here's another part of the problem is if the business owner chooses not, and they've amended the bill, they amended it and they took out the words misgendering and dead naming, and they replaced it with the chosen name. And so it sounds much more, vanilla, sounds much more innocent. But if you walk into a business and the business owner does misgender or dead name you or use, as they say, the not use the chosen name, then you can file a claim of discrimination with the Colorado Civil Rights Commission, and the businesses could be fined. So this is blatant government overreach. And we've seen this progressing throughout the past few years in this state, and it's culminated in this particular bill, and it's created such a firestorm that I, for the first time, I saw pastors organize a rally against this bill on 2 occasions down at the state capitol.
And Bill, I can't remember a time in the 30 years that I've been involved in Colorado politics that the conservatives, the homeschoolers, the pastors have been so animated and involved in the political situation here in the state, which I guess is a good sign. But we also had some conservative legislators that pushed pretty hard against this, right, Adam?
Yes. Republican Colorado State Representative Jarvis Caldwell offered an amendment to H.R. 25-1312 that said public schools had to have parental consent to allow a student to change his or her name in school. And sadly, that amendment was defeated. And we want to feature a clip now of what he said from the floor of the Colorado House. Passionate.
A piece that's still in this bill that was in the original version is Section 6, and it talks about name changes in schools. And I ran an amendment that said you have to have parental consent to change your name in school if you are a child. And that amendment was defeated. Now, let me be clear to the members in here. In my family, Names have a meaning. There's a tradition there. I named my children. Who are any of you to tell me that my child can go to school and change their name without my even knowledge? Who are any of you to say that? I gave them their names. I was there when they were born. I was there when they said their first words and took their first steps. I was there on their first day of school, and I will be there on their last day of school. And I will be there when they have children of their own, and they name their children. And God willing, my children will be by my side as I lay on my deathbed and take my last breaths on this earth. Not a single person in this room will be. Stop putting yourselves, the government, between us parents and our children. We are sick and tired of it. It's not about hating trans people. It's not about any of that. It's about putting yourselves in between us and our kids. We are sick and tired of it. And that's why we have fought this bill. I want you to think about that. We received thousands of emails, thousands of phone calls. Not because thousands of people around Colorado hate trans people. It's because they're sick of the bills we're passing infringing on their rights. And this perhaps may be the most egregious we've seen so far. That's why we feel this way. It is not about hate. It is about love. The love I have for my kids.
Bill, this is a toxic cocktail of this evil, transgendering, immoral worldview that is foisted upon kids in the public schools and throughout these states, and the power of government stepping in to control parental rights, business rights. This is that terrible combination of immorality and a tyranny that's just blended more so than I think any other bill I've seen in the history of the state. And
it is tyranny. And our citizens need to rise up and say, we will not. In fact, I've heard two pastors yesterday on Sunday address their congregants and address the state government with, we will not abide by this law. We will not recognize this law. This law goes against God's word. Now, when was the last time you had a number of pastors do that?
Well, the sad thing is they've exempted the churches but not the businesses, and so it's the Christian businessmen that are going to jail,
right? And
they're going to be fined for this, which means that the pastors better go into jail with them,
right?
And better stand there right side by side.
There
with
are
them.
pastors who are rising up, and they're calling what this is evil.
Let's talk about Ideology Camp. This is the I'd Rather Have Jesus camp here in the state of Colorado. There's a Fox News story that came out, 4 hours ago that dealt with this. Apparently, the Colorado Department of Early Childhood has asked Ideology Camp to choose between holding its biblical beliefs about biological sex and risk losing its license. They could even lose their license on this.
Terrible.
Or abandon their beliefs and mission by forcing girls and boys to shower, dress, and share sleeping quarters with campers of the opposite sex. They say that we are asking the court to allow us to operate consistent with our beliefs, and they are suing the state on this one. So that's the Fox News story that just came out, 3-4 hours ago. And wow, the I'd Rather Have Jesus camp, Idrahaji, that stands for I'd Rather Have Jesus.
Yeah, Idrahaji.
Is, I would say the Idranatri, the Idranahi, I'd rather not go transgender on this. Idranatri camp, perhaps they changed their name to that, Idranatri. I'd rather not be trans. But Idrahaji camp is suing the state on this issue.
Good for them. Mike DeBoer, the executive director, if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, he said Camp Idrahaji has faithfully served and ministered to Colorado children of all backgrounds and faiths since 1948 and has successfully maintained its camp license since it received one in 1995. The new policy of the Colorado Department of Early Childhood, however, is asking Idrahaji to choose between upholding its biblical beliefs about biological sex and risk losing its license. I'll tell you this, that if the choice is do this ungodly, evil thing that the Colorado state has now mandated, or lose the license and shut down, any self-respecting Christian group, sadly, as much as it would pain them, would shut down. They're not going to move forward with risking a violation of God's law to please man. This is a a Peter situation who said, I'd rather obey God than man.
Do you think, Bill, that these state departments have the power to put these camps out of business or put businesses out of business, short, I guess, an appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States?
Well, this is where the Colorado legislature has again exceeded its authority. They created the CDEC, the Colorado Department of Early Education, in July 1st. It went into effect July 1st, 2022.
So it was only 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
So this
and they're the ones evidently that are regulating these camps for the youth of our state.
Right. So they've weaponized the government again through these agencies, and these agencies then have rules and regs that they put into practice. So the law creates the agency creates the rules and regs, and then the people suffer. And so here's what the legislature should do. They won't, because they're Democrat controlled. They should dismantle this particular department. They should get rid of it. They had an opportunity. The Republicans had an opportunity a few years ago after the Jack Phillips case, where Jack Phillips was persecuted for holding to his beliefs. And they had an opportunity, because the Republicans controlled both houses and the governorship, if I'm not mistaken, to do away with the Colorado Department of the anti-discrimination laws, the Colorado Department of Civil Rights. They had an opportunity, the Republicans had an opportunity to do away with the Colorado Department of Civil Rights, and they've refused to do so.
But did they have the majority at that point?
Yes, they could have done it.
Oh, they could have done it at that point. Yeah. Well, it's probably one of our biggest problems is that we've got too many rhinos and not enough Republicans committed to principle. At the end of the day, Bill, we're just going to need people who are willing to put their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the line for principle and the principles of liberty and righteousness for the nation. And I do think it comes down to whether or not we can get a concerted minority to commit themselves to God's law and to defend the liberties of the citizenry. Without that, we will not make progress on this. Well, let's come back in just a moment. I've got a little bit more on Liberty Counsel's appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court of the United States in the case of Kentucky clerk Kim Davis. Will we get a chance at reversing Obergefell? Will the Republicans really commit themselves to reversing one of the most egregious decisions made by the Supreme Court or any Supreme Court in the history of the world? That next on Generations. Stay with us.
Of all the events that we do here at Generations, probably one of the most important to our mission of passing on the faith is our annual Father and Son retreats. I'm Danny Craig, National Director here for Generations, sitting with David Braun, longtime Father-Son retreat attendee. David, what's been most impactful for you and your son attending the Father-Son retreats?
Danny, what's been most impactful for me has just been a great excuse to spend time with my son, first and foremost. Everyone's busy, and it's a great way to get away. It's 3 nights long, which gives you a lot of time to just be together. Mm-hmm. That's been the most impactful. And of course, the leadership has been great. They're humble, they're loving, they're kind. They just want to spend time with everyone who comes. And I'd say finally, the camaraderie of hundreds of other fathers and sons who are all in very different places, yet united in their desire to love their families well and their sons well. So we did a bunch of hiking, and it's right in your backyard. You just step out your room and off you go. There's just miles and miles of trails. The zip line is a ton of fun. And then also just playing games at night, foosball, board games. And again, doing that alongside other fathers and sons has been the best part. It's absolutely worth it. And just realize you're going to learn so much more than you thought. You're going to be blessed in ways you didn't expect. You will absolutely return the following year, I guarantee it.
Friends, join us this year for the Colorado Father-Son Retreat in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, August 14th through 17th, and also second event, August 21st through 24th, for a great time of teaching, encouragement, fellowship with other dads, and ultimately the opportunity to step away and spend time on this important relationship in your family. Join us. Go to coloradofatherson.com. That's coloradofatherson.com.
And we are back on Generations. This is Kevin Swanson, as will Bill Jack from Worldview Academy and Adam McManus, our host from theworldview.com. And this is Worldview News and Review. And friends, these are some of the most significant stories that have happened in the last week. And first, of course, the HB 1312 signed by the governor of the state of Colorado, one of the most egregious bills in the history of this state, certainly, and certainly America as well. Colorado tends to be on the front lines on this. As I said, they were the ones to legitimize abortion in 1967, and now they're one of the first states to legitimize homosexual marriage. This would have been prior to Obergefell, and then one of the first states of America to get this far down the track on the transgender vision. Okay, now
the leaders are proud of that.
Yeah, Liberty Counsel is appealing to the U.S. Supreme Court on the Kim Davis case. Now, she was the Kentucky clerk who stood against homosexual marriage or recording homosexual marriages in the state of Kentucky. And evidently she was fined a certain amount of money. I can't remember how much, but she is taking her case to the Supreme Court of the United States. She argues the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment protects her from liability and damages for refusing to issue a same-sex marriage license against her religious beliefs. In other words, she's bringing the First Amendment to bear on this because the First Amendment allows for freedom of religion and freedom of religious beliefs. And she says this should apply to the issue of same-sex marriage, and she should not be fined for not issuing a same-sex marriage, whereas those that had apparently applied for this could have gone anywhere else for it. That's her argument. Now, apparently, chairman and founder of Liberty Counsel, Matt Stavers, saying that the case underscores why the U.S. Supreme Court should overturn Obergefell v. Hodges, because that decision threatens the religious liberty of many Americans who believe that marriage is a sacred institution between one man and one woman. So here it is, the First Amendment argument against Obergefell, and he's hoping that there will be something of a reversal of Obergefell. It's interesting also, Idaho's legislative session this year has issued a resolution requesting an overturn of Obergefell. So it's not just Kim Davis and Liberty Counsel's Matt Staver that's going for this, but there are others across the country that would like to see a reversal of Obergefell. You think it'll happen, Bill?
Well, we will see. I'm skeptical, but at the same time, I believe that God is moving in this nation, and that he can move on the hearts of those who are in positions of authority, that he guides their hearts like he directs the stream of a river.
And kudos to Matt Staver and Liberty Counsel. At least they're fighting the good fight. And I do think this needs to be a full court press. Wherever we are, even we're on my third yard line, and we're pressed all the way back onto our territory. We need to keep pressing forward on this, Adam. I think it's a good attempt, but it's hard for me to believe that there's going to be a reversal on this unless some of the conservatives on the Supreme Court that voted in favor of Obergefell, and Bostock, by the way, should reverse position. And I don't know if they will or not. I'm thinking about John Roberts.
It's unlikely.
Two things. Number one, Kim Davis was fined $360,104. So this is not inconsequential. She has every right to not be mandated to sign off on, as a justice of the peace, a same-sex marriage license, because it violates her deeply held religious convictions. Number two, the person who sponsored that particular Idaho resolution, as it were, they call it a House Joint Memorial 1, it passed in January 46-24. Her name is Heather Scott, and she said this. She said, what if the federal government redefined property rights or nationalized water rights? What does that look like if they come up with some new fair use policy or come up with different ways to define property rights? This is not a decision for the judges. It is a decision for the states. And she said that Obergefell, the 2015 Supreme Court decision that legalized marriage between two men and two women, poses threats to religious liberty. She said, as we've talked ad nauseum, cake makers, photographers are pressured to support these homosexual marriages, something they don't agree with, the Christian ones. And she said Christians are often targeted. So I am thrilled, and I would love to see what Heather Scott did, the Idaho state representative, the Republican, in that state legislature. I would love to see similar introductions of similarly worded statements to push back on Obergefell, because nobody has talked in any of the fundraising letters I've gotten over the last, since 2015, really, about overturning Obergefell. It's moved on to the transgender and on abortion, but Obergefell it's like crickets out there, except for Matt Staver and Idaho.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I don't think anybody sees us gaining much political favor on this issue. The average conservative, average Christian organizations probably saying there's not much traction on this. My guess is God is most concerned about this issue. In fact, I believe that God's more concerned about this than the transgender issue. Certainly in the Old Testament, we see the death penalty leveled against homosexuality, but not transgenderism. I just think that's interesting. And it indicates God's commitment to bringing his judgment down upon the Sodom and Gomorrahs of the world for the sin of homosexuality, which is obviously being encouraged by the Supreme Court of the United States by this sort of thing. And by the way, I also think the whole concept of homosexual mirage, which we like to call it homosexual mirage, is a farce. It's, I think, intended as a farce. I think it's a purposeful attempt to violate or to destroy or to undermine or to bring some sort of destruction to the whole institution of marriage. I honestly think homosexuals have no real commitment to this marriage idea. A new Pew Research Center survey found 75% of gay, lesbian, and bisexual Americans find homosexual open marriages acceptable. And I don't really want to define what an open marriage is. It basically means that they don't care about adultery. It's no big deal. You can go and have sex with whatever you want to have sex with. It's no big deal. That's our worldview. That's what we do. But again, 75% of gay, lesbian, bisexual Americans find open marriages, quote unquote, acceptable. That's a new Pew Research Center survey that came out this year. So it's pretty new.
And beyond that, it's important to note that Gallup has documented that only 10% of homosexuals actually get married. So there was not some, beating down the door. We want to get married. We want to remain faithful to one another, even though it's in an illicit way that God and the Bible don't approve of. No, only 10% ever get married compared to heterosexuals, where 90% get married.
So they're just blowing it up. Exactly. This is an attempt to completely destroy the institution of marriage in the 21st century. I think we just need to acknowledge that. Just, hey, this is what they're trying to do. And I think the average homosexual would probably say, yeah, that's what we're trying to do. 75% of gay, lesbian, bisexual Americans find homosexual open marriages acceptable. But meantime, and here's the other thing. You say, well, what about heterosexuals? What would they say about open marriages? Well, 91% of Americans believe heterosexual adultery in marriage relationships is wrong. So 91% of, and my guess is that, a certain percentage of those are homosexuals. So that's why they think adultery is a wonderful thing. But among the broader population of Americans, 91% of them believe that heterosexual adultery in marriage is just wrong. Now, it's interesting, in Gallup's assessment of American morality, adultery is the one thing they're still standing against. They're okay with shacking up. They're okay with premarital sex. They're okay with abortion, a lot of things like that. But the one thing that your average American is very much opposed to is any kind of adultery that takes place in the situation of heterosexual marriage.
Nobody wants to be cheated.
The whole idea of cheating,
yes.
Your cheating heart will tell on you. Ever since,
right.
Country music singers were writing those songs in the 1940s and 50s, Americans have pretty much agreed on this, that adultery is just a sinful, evil, wicked act, and we're not to engage in this. But not so much for those who don't take marriage seriously. We're talking about the homosexual crowd. Again, 75% of gay, lesbian, bisexual Americans find open marriages just A-okay. And here's one more thing. According to USA Today, 16 times more homosexuals are in open relationships as opposed to those that are in closed relationships within marriage. Again, 16 times more homosexuals are in open relationships as opposed to regular marriages. So no surprise whatsoever. They're actually, hey, no big deal. Marriage doesn't count for anything anyway. So let's just go ahead and violate God's law at every possible opportunity. The degree of promiscuity that goes on within this crowd has been very much debated. I don't think I even want to ask the question. It's just too disgusting to think about. But this perversion of marriage has been intended to destroy the very concept of faithful marriage of one spouse to another, male to female. That was the whole reason. That's why Obergefell. That's why the zeitgeist is pushed so hard. And this demonic force is so strong that anybody speaking against it, which is what we're doing today, are going to face a tremendous political pushback over this sort of thing. You can take actually a fairly strong position on the issue of adultery. You can take a fairly strong position on even the issue of abortion, some of these other things. But if you stand against homosexuality, if you take a position against homosexual mirage, you're going to be facing some pretty serious spiritual pushback over that sort of thing. Believe me, I can testify to that. But here's my question. Will the U.S. Supreme Court reverse Obergefell? Now, my answer is absolutely. Obergefell won't last for very long, and here's the reason. I want to give a little bit of reasoning to this. Been thinking about it for a couple of days, especially since the signing of HB 1312 here in the state of Colorado. So will this governor last forever? Will this ideology survive for the next 180 years? That's the question before us. Well, it turns out that wicked ideological trends really do come down. For example, eugenics and racial supremacy lasted for about 60 years. Witchcraft and seances dominated America from 1800 to about 1865. Abraham Lincoln brought seances into the White House. This horrible legacy lasted for about 65 years. Slavery in America lasted from the nation's founding as a nation for about 75 years. England's involvement in the slave trade lasted from 1680 to about 1800, about 120 years. Often it takes a war to put an end to these terrible, terrible ideologies, as in the Civil War. Put an end to a lot of things. It just takes a lot of dead bodies and a shock to a nation if we're going to get a reset like that. World War I, World War II as well. It's probably World War II, or probably take a World War III to put an end to the modern trends of sodomy and abortion. It's just the way things typically work in history. They just don't last forever. As we've said before, you can look diligently for the place of the wicked and it shall not be found, eventually. But eugenics and white supremacy was a big deal at the turn of the 20th century. You remember that? Think about eugenics, how powerful it was. Almost everybody supported eugenics. I mean, if it was somebody like me, sitting in a basement or out here on the eastern plains of Colorado in a rather ignominious sort of situation, speaking against eugenics, nobody would have listened to me in 1920. Absolutely nobody. Teddy Roosevelt, Helen Keller, the U.S. Supreme Court, Margaret Sanger, all caught up in this Darwinistic eugenics program in the 1920s. The eugenicist social Darwinism was the ideology that produced those two world wars. There were 70,000 forced sterilizations in the U.S. around that period of time. You remember the Supreme Court of the United States actually came down on the side of eugenics. Remember, it said, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. Remember, it was one of the statements made by a Supreme Court justice. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough. We will force sterilizations on all the imbeciles in America from here on out. Okay, this whole racial superiority, this whole eugenic thing was a huge thing. About the only person to stand against it was Calvin Coolidge. He's one of the most decent presidents we've had in the history of this country. Not so much Theodore Roosevelt, certainly not FDR, and certainly not Woodrow Wilson. They were basically scumbags. But we cover a lot of these ideologies behind these wars in my book, American God's Providence. By the way, be sure you get a Christian view, a Christian history of America in God's Providence. We bring out all of these stories. Ultimately, it was Charles Darwin, Francis Galton, and Herbert Spencer that brought about World War I and World War II. The Germans were very big on racial superiority. The Kaiser was all about that, and that's why World War I. That's why World War II with Adolf Hitler. We all know this. It's pretty obvious at this point. Herbert Spencer wanted to apply Charles Darwin's evolution to social engineering. Spencer taught that nations were to engage in a struggle of the survival of the strongest. Between roughly 1877 and 1900, between 1877 and 1900, 33 translations of Spencer's works were produced in Japan. It's all about that. That's why the Japanese were so big on World War I and World War II, eventually into World War II, because they really agreed with Spencer. Herbert Spencer and Francis Galton and Charles Darwin was what it was all about in the 1870s and 1880s and 1890s. The end result, of course, was the Japanese raped Nanking, 350,000 people slaughtered, one of the most inhumane, cruel slaughters of human beings in the modern age. And don't forget the wretched genocides of the Nazis and others. But friends, a 1945 study prepared by the Japanese cabinet demonstrated with extensive historical data that war was constructive and protracted war was inevitable. And indeed, that protracted war required the thoroughgoing exercise of a nation's unique racial power. The nation's unique racial power. That's what it was all about to bring about World War II. That's the Japanese cabinet and their conclusion concerning what it was that brought about World War II. But with the bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima and with the suicide of Adolf Hitler in that bunker, that pretty much put the entire eugenics thing out of its misery. Forced sterilizations aren't happening today. Outside of a few whacked Christian groups, the neo-Nazis, this ideology is dead, dead, dead. Only 4% of Americans are in favor of white supremacy today. Now, my point is this. These terrible ideologies, they don't last very long. Eugenics lasted about 60 to 70 years. Yes, it took about 100 million dead bodies and World War I, World War II to put the whole thing to bed or to the grave. But that's the way it worked. Well, abortion in America is 50 years old. It's got about 10 to 20 years left, and then it will be over. World War III, and it's over. Because remember, Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and he's bringing his enemies under his footstool. So we don't have much left on abortion. We don't have much left on transgenderism and the homosexual ideology of the last 40 to 50 years. Bill, this stuff goes away. Now, it could be 10 years, 15 years. That's pretty much historically about how long these things last. Okay, they don't last forever. Okay, you can come back to me and say, Kev, it may be another 40 years. Okay, I'll grant you 40 years, whatever. But it's not going to be forever. Okay? Why? One simple reason. Jesus is King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He's not going to let this governor of Colorado, Governor Love of 1967 or Governor What's-His-Face of 2025, he's not going to let these governors go forever. They'll be dead in the grave within a few years, and then these ideologies will be gone. That's the way it works in history. Right? I mean, can't we look at it from that perspective, Bill? Instead of saying, all of this is inevitable, the devil always wins.
Well, I'm reminded of Psalm 37:13. But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming.
Their day is coming. And he's got it scheduled on his calendar.
That does not mean that we sit back and wait for that. We work actively to snatch those from the pit. And we work actively to rescue those who are perishing. We work actively to proclaim truth and grace. And we see people's hearts changed. We see people's sphere of influence change. We see the cultures salted and lighted with truth and grace. And liberty abounds in those periods.
And we prepare our children and grandchildren to take up the reins 30 years from now. Again, we need to be forward enough with this bill to see that they will have an opportunity to reestablish principled governments and the liberty and the freedoms that flow from that.
This is what Obergefell in 2015 at the Supreme Court mandating homosexual marriage was so heartbreaking, because 31 states out of 50 had taken the time to pass constitutional amendments that said something very specific. Well, one sentence amendment: a marriage between a man and a woman is the only domestic legal union that shall be valid or recognized in this state, as Idaho did in 2006, as Texas did. When I was on the airwaves 3 hours a day on KSLR in San Antonio, we talked about it for, a huge chunk of time to make sure that we went to the polls and we passed this marriage protection amendment like 30 other states had done. And with the flip of a switch, the Supreme Court is able to basically overturn the will of the people and the will of God.
And again, this thing won't last forever. And I think our obligation is to put a full court press in the political sphere. But at the same time, Bill, I think the key thing right now is to prepare the next generation to take the reins of governments. They will have an opportunity. I believe it. And prepare these young ones. Hey, our young 18, 20-year-olds, 30 years from now, they'll be what, 50 years of age, 55, 60 years of age, which is about the right time to be the next congressman and senators and perhaps the next president and vice president of the United States. I mean, can you look at it that way? Can we look at the future this way and say, hey, we have an obligation to raise these children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord Jesus Christ in our homes, and then prepare them with a biblical worldview so that they know how to disciple nations in these various aspects of these institutions in which they will have some opportunity to be the salt and light in their generation.
And thanks for the softball
Yeah,
pitch
exactly.
to me.
I'm doing it for Worldview Academy.
Because Worldview Academy leadership camps, we do that with students 13 to 18, and then with Worldview Crux, we have a 2-semester program for students who are just out of high school who want to get rooted and grounded in their beliefs before they hit their careers or their college experience. And it's redeeming their freshman year of college by teaching them a biblical view of the humanities, a biblical view of apologetics, a biblical view of what Scripture has to say about all of these issues, including in the political arena. And so, yeah, thanks for tossing
Bill,
me that softball.
Toss
Kevin.
me back the softball so I can hit it one more time.
Yeah,
and that's
here
why
comes-
the Generations curriculum, in which we've tried to provide 12 years of biblical worldview-based material to prepare our students to go to Worldview Academy.
Thank you.
How about that?
Yeah.
Okay, I just tossed it back to you. Okay. Well, you can get our Worldview materials. And I have really dedicated 25 years of my life to put together all of these textbooks to prepare our young people with a biblical view of things to be the salt and life that God has called them to be in various aspects and institutions. Well, friends, that wraps up this edition of the Generations broadcast. My co-hosts today have been Adam McManus as well, Bill Jack from Worldview Academy. It's good to have you brothers with us as we engage these most important stories in our Worldview News and Review segment of Generations. Be sure to catch the worldview.com on a daily basis. If you don't have it on your cell phone, your iPhone, please pick it up. It's basically just generations.org at this point, but be sure to have access to the worldview.com on a daily basis. This is Kevin Swanson inviting you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation.